In the 1960s and 70s, Africa was a bloody battleground between Cold War rivals and their proxy armies. As African states gained their independence, dictators and rebels were propped up by the world's superpowers. As the Cold War ended, both East and West abandoned the governments they had fought to install, and brutal civil wars soon ravaged the continent.
That's real terrorism. They're going to slit us open. They're going to chop our hands off. They'll probably bloody well eat us.
Well-trained, experienced mercenaries were increasingly called upon to try and win these never-ending wars.
Either the enemy kill me, or I kill the enemy.
This is the story of how private military companies like Executive Outcomes and Sandline International redefined how modern wars are fought and what it means to be a mercenary.
June 1960, King Baudouin of Belgium arrives in Leopoldville to grant independence to the newly created...
In 1960, the Belgian Congo became the Republic of the Congo, as the country gained its independence.
An autonomous state, the Belgians strike their flag and prepare to leave.
On June the 30th, Patrice Lumumba became the country's first democratically elected leader. The West saw Lumumba as an ideological opponent, a socialist who would end decades of European exploitation in the Congo. The Belgian government, supported by the British and Americans, used the temporary instability afforded by the transition of power to undermine Lumumba. Lumumba turned to the Soviet Union for help. Colonel Joseph Mobutu and his military junta replaced the democratically elected government to prevent the Congo's vast resources falling into Soviet hands. Mobutu ordered the arrest of Lumumba, charging him with inciting the army into rebellion. Lumumba was captured, beaten, tortured, and put to death by firing squad. The installation of Joseph Mobutu led to a reign of terror and spectacular corruption that would last 32 years.
This is a period of independence for African countries. What we see are political power struggles, and mercenaries are very much employed by the African leaders themselves, either to seize power or to stay in power.
In 1964, an uprising known as the Simba Rebellion swept across the Congo. The Simba insurgents saw the new government as being too Western and ignoring the people of Congo. The Simba rebels intimidated the Congolese army into retreat without a fight. As towns and cities fell into Simba hands, thousands of Congolese government officials, opposition leaders, school teachers and police officers were executed.
The streets of Stanleyville are quiet, but it is the ominous quiet that is an epilogue to terror.
Predominantly white mercenaries from South Africa, Rhodesia and elsewhere were brought in to put down the rebellion. They had an immediate impact. The Simbas were forced to improvise and quickly learnt the value of taking white Europeans as hostages. With more than 100,000 in the Congo, the rebellion suddenly gained international publicity and became known as the Congo Crisis.
In the Congo, what we see, 64-65, is a mercenary operation led by the likes of Mike Hoare. But the Americans used this mercenary force to counter a threat, what they would see a threat from the Soviets, and they were very successful.
In July 1965, Michael Thomas Hoare, or Mad Mike Hoare, was hired by the Congolese Prime Minister to command a unit of mercenaries, the 5th Commando, ANC. 300 strong and mostly made up of South Africans, they played a vital role in Operation Dragon Rouge, a mission to secure the release of 1,600 white European hostages and liberate the capital, Stanleyville. In just 16 months, Hoare's unit was able to rescue the majority of the hostages and put down the Simba insurgency. However, despite the phenomenal success of Hoare's campaign, it soon became clear that men under his command had committed atrocities.
The word mercenary was made filthy during the Congo. You had a lot of cutthroat types going in there being hired.
There is a pejorative use of the word mercenary, and a lot of that pejorative sense, I think, stems from the Congo conflict in the 60s, when there was some sort of dreadful rape and pillage and, nunneries being ransacked. In those days, very often the military objective was the bank, because, what they really wanted to do was just simply take the bank and nick the gold.
Among Hoare's men was the notorious Siegfried Müller, aka Congo Müller, a former Nazi Wehrmacht soldier who continued to wear his Iron Cross. Müller was promoted to captain under Hoare and led 50 men in a subunit of 5 commando. The actions of Müller and his men guaranteed that mercenaries would have a hideous reputation for years to come. Beheadings and boiling skulls are documented in these haunting photographs. After a huge media backlash, it became much harder for mercenaries to get work. To win government and private contracts, they would need to become legitimate entities adhering to international law. The people offering mercenaries for hire now called themselves private military companies, or PMCs.
Private military companies are really a function of the end of the Cold War. What we found in the 1990s was that the huge standing armies of NATO under the Warsaw Pact, and also of regimes like the South African apartheid regime, countries which had a need for a huge and highly trained military force, found that that need was suddenly gone.
The nature of war was changing, and with it the requirements of governments and the fighting men they hired.
In post-apartheid South Africa, there are a group of extremely skillful, very dangerous special forces operatives whose job it has been to assassinate ANC activists, to agitate in the wars on the border of South Africa in places like Angola, who find their units disbanded. What they do under a man called Eben Barlow is they set up a company called Executive Outcomes.
Former Lieutenant Colonel Eben Barlow set up the company with former members of South Africa's notorious Special Ops Branch, the Civil Cooperation Bureau. Hiring experienced and hardened veterans from South Africa meant that Executive Outcomes was already a highly trained, coherent fighting force, well-versed in African conflict. The promise of huge profits from official government contracts meant that Executive Outcomes had to move away from the negative image of mercenaries and reinvent themselves as a professional corporation.
Executive Outcomes' mission is to provide the most professional military training related to land, sea, and air warfare.
And this company is, on the one hand, we'd recognize its mercenary roots. On the other hand, we'd see it in many ways as a modern corporation. It had brochures, it had videos, it had price lists, it had rate cards.
Executive Outcomes also had strong links with the British mercenary firm Sandline International, backed by ex-SAS member Tony Buckingham. These companies provided military personnel, training and logistical support in both offensive and defensive operations, creating the blueprint for all modern private military companies.
I think it was very professional. Firstly, they were led by some very highly qualified officers from the South African Defence Force. They also had good backing from the British backers. It's a business, it's a corporate business, it's well structured.
In 1992, a new mercenary company, Executive Outcomes, conducted its first major operation in Africa. With the help of Tony Buckingham, they won a contract to recover the Soyo oil fields in Angola that had been captured by UNITA rebels. It heralded the start of a whole new era for the private military company.
It actually started in Angola. You had a guerrilla war going on there for more than 20 years. There was a rebel leader called Jonas Savimbi, very competent guerrilla fighter, and he controlled about 9/10 of the entire Angola, which is an enormous country with wealth beyond belief. Oil, diamonds, gold, hardwoods, everything. But the country was crippled by this guerrilla war.
Angola had been torn apart by a 17-year-long civil war between the ruling People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or MPLA, led by José Eduardo dos Santos, and the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi. Savimbi was a charismatic leader well-versed in guerrilla fighting, but despite controlling 70% of the country, he could not secure a decisive victory. In 1992, peace talks were brokered with the promise of elections and an end to the fighting. This brief window of stability attracted international investment keen to exploit Angola's largely untapped natural resources.
We were in Angola on an oil project. When I say we, I mean Heritage Oil and Gas. But I mean, the big companies were all there. You know, it wasn't like us. We weren't the sort of frontiersmen. The big boys were there, European and American.
The results of the election saw the ruling MPLA government retain power. The UNITA forces refused to accept the result, reigniting the civil war.
I had sat with General Savimbi, and Savimbi said, whether we win or lose this election, I promise you, we are not going to go back to war. I thought he was sincere. 2 months, 3 months later, bang.
In January 1993, Savimbi led his UNITA rebels to capture the port of Soyo, depriving the MPLA of its main source of income and halting international investment.
Tony Buckingham just said, look, Simon, this is it. This is the end of the company because we've only got one project. UNITA have overrun Soyo. The project is dead. This company is dead. You better start looking for another job. We then kicked it around. We said, well, maybe we could just recapture this place, you know, with a force, with 100 mercenaries, backed up by Angolan government forces. So we suggested to the Angolans, who thought about it not very long, hauled us down there and said, OK, guys, you're on.
Buckingham and Mann contacted a recently established and then little-known South African PMC, Executive Outcomes, to provide the fighting force.
Buckingham went to Luanda, the capital of Angola, and he saw the president because he was on very good terms with him, and he said, look, I can bring a bunch of South African mercenaries in here to turn this war around. You have a very big project at the moment that is lying in waste in the oil fields in the north. Let me bring them in.
General Jean de Matos, who was the head of the Angolan Armed Forces, and I remember him saying through the interpreter, he's saying, OK, you're going to retake Soyo with a small group. Can you explain how you're going to do that, you see? So Tony goes, sort of, Simon, would you care to explain to the general? He said, well, sir, what we will actually do will be a classic special forces coup de main. And everyone went, very good. And of course, I had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. Neither did I.
Buckingham and Mann's plan was simple: to recapture Soyo with a spearhead battalion of South African mercenaries, backed up by a brigade of the Angolan Armed Forces. The South African mercenaries were uniquely qualified to defeat the UNITA rebels. They had trained and fought alongside them for years during the South Africa border wars. However, the operation would be far from easy. The loyalty of the South African mercenaries against their former allies had yet to be put to the test.
We didn't know how loyal the South Africans would be because we were just about to go and fight the people that they'd been training. We're absolutely certain that information is going back to Pretoria at a phenomenal rate, and probably instructions are coming the other way. My argument to them was, hey, UNITA restarted this war. There was no need for them to restart it whatsoever. So don't worry about fighting these guys. These guys are criminals. These are not actually, because this is a totally illegal act. They have no right whatsoever to restart this war.
To confound matters, many of the MPLA military was equally as distrustful of this newfound allegiance.
The Angolan army said, why should we trust these people? They are our traditional enemies. They are our foes. They are racist, hated.
Ultimately, there was a lot of suspicion from the MPLA, the government and the military towards us, because we were their sworn enemies, and I think a lot vice versa, because we've been fighting them for so long.
Despite this, the mission went ahead. The men of Executive Outcomes were posted at a former Cuban base 120 kilometers south of Luanda.
We arrived in Angola raw, just with the clothes we had and a small suitcase.
On February the 16th, 1993, Executive Outcomes travelled north and launched the assault to recapture the Soyo oil fields.
60 South Africans flew in by helicopter, and a few hours later, a landing craft arrived with 1,300 Angolan troops, who then linked up with the South Africans, and battle commenced. were expecting us. We're 3,000 of UNITA's best.
The UNITA are really fighters. They have the same philosophy as we have. Once you fight, you go ahead, never go back. If you go back, only when you're dead.
The fighting would be brutal, with sympathies between UNITA and the mercenaries quickly forgotten.
They were down to hand grenade range, grenade throwing range, with massed attacks by UNITA in the first few days.
We lost, and we sweat, we lost blood, we got hurt. UNITA is really very dangerous.
I've never been involved in anything like that. Not before or since. That was really, you know, down to the wire. Tony, of course, being Tony, who'd absolutely promised he wouldn't do it, went in on the helicopters. And I sort of knew it when I saw the helicopters attacking. You know, I bet that bastard's on one of those helicopters.
Just 6 weeks into the operation, Executive Outcomes, with the support of the Angolan government, had succeeded in recapturing the Soyo oil fields, forcing UNITA back into the bush.
By the time Soyo had been recaptured, the Angolans said, look, guys, we are losing the war. And they were. Can you help us win the war? We thought about it, long and hard, actually. And we thought, in the end, OK, yeah. So we said, well, we'll do it. We'll help you. But it's going to cost you a lot of money. And it, you know, it did. And that was when Executive Outcomes really got going.
Executive Outcomes now turned their attention to training the Angolan government army and neutralising the remaining UNITA forces.
What we've done is we've modified the doctrine which enables the Angolan army to feel comfortable with what they're being taught, and nevertheless to anticipate how UNITA will react on the battlefield, and the result of that has been outstanding.
Barlow realised that what was fueling the war was diamonds and oil, diamonds in particular. So he had to cut off UNITA's supply to diamonds, so they couldn't buy weapons.
The UNITA guerrillas were using the diamonds to sponsor their side of the war, where the Angolan government, the MPLA, they were using obviously the oil money. So there was good money flowing into both sides. To bring peace, one of them had to go, and the target then was the UNITA.
57-20, rápido, por favor.
Executive Outcomes sought to make a decisive strike on UNITA's headquarters in Kafumfo. 100 Executive Outcomes mercenaries travelled deep within rebel-held territory to face 1,500 well-trained UNITA troops.
It was hard because even there when you go there, it's just counting between me and thin line of death. Because those people were trained by us. We trained together, we fought with them. Now here we went to fight them. I'm telling you, man, it's a dangerous situation.
They had one major advantage, their own aviation wing. This meant they could supply their troops and launch precision strikes on UNITA positions. But these pilots would face risks of their own.
We were still in support of the advance onto Kafum. Lawrence Bosch was doing reconnaissance with the PC-7 in advance of our forces. And if he had found targets, he would bring in the MiG-23 to do bombing. And then obviously the helicopter would support with troops. We were probably about 5-10 kilometers away when Lawrence called us and said that he's been taking fire. We heard Lawrence say that he's going down, he's going to crash. So immediately we flew in his general direction. We were now looking for the wreckage and expecting smoke. Next minute, Lawrence came on the air on his handheld radio, calling us and said, right, guys, I can hear you, come towards me. He'd survived a crash in the trees. And he's on the ground there waiting for us to come and fetch him. We saw him, went into land, and as we approached, they were standing right in front of us, 20, 30 meters away. We could see them clearly. We were sitting there, we sent our engineer out to go and call them and bring them into the helicopter. We waited for them, nothing happened. And then suddenly the chopper started vibrating, but violently vibrating. At the same time, coming down the road was a group of about 20 or 30 soldiers that were running towards the helicopter. Next minute, they got so close, they were sort of 20 meters from us. And we couldn't take it anymore, so we just took power and got airborne. As we got airborne, the tail rotor was badly damaged, and it started spinning as we were climbing out of the trees. And in that spin, we saw Lawrence lying on the ground, and he'd had a huge gash right through his shoulder and chest. And he'd walked into our tail rotor, and the whole tail rotor was bent, and badly bent.
Despite their losses, Executive Outcomes repeatedly succeeded in defeating much larger opponents with superior tactics and advanced technology.
This small force, using armored vehicles on the ground, managed to penetrate sort of 600 kilometers through UNITA territory, through ambushes, and hit right at their headquarters in Kafum, forcing them to negotiate, because we took over that area with such a small group.
The big strikes on the diamond fields at Kafumfus took them about 10 days to overrun an entire guerrilla force. And they did so with minimal losses.
In just 18 months, Executive Outcomes had forced the much bigger UNITA to the negotiating table and illustrated to the world the effectiveness of a well-trained, well-supplied mercenary unit.
They did it so effectively that the peace negotiations included a clause that Executive Outcomes had to leave the country.
Shortly after the ceasefire, Executive Outcomes' contract was terminated. In 1991, civil war broke out in Sierra Leone. The Revolutionary United Front, or RUF, with support from Liberian forces, attempted to overthrow the ruling government led by Joseph Momo. The RUF quickly took control of southern and eastern parts of Sierra Leone, seizing many of the country's diamond fields. Unstable government and years of economic decline had left the country in ruins. On the 29th of April 1992, the 25-year-old Captain Valentine Strasser would come to power in an astonishing coup. He and his men had never meant to take power. They just wanted to complain about not being paid.
He got together a couple of his friends and said, look, this is just ridiculous. We can't carry on being soldiers if we're not being paid. So that little movement then gathered a few more people, and they decided to drive to Freetown, to state their case. But by the time they got to Freetown, they were now the rebels, and the president was gone.
After their success in Angola, Executive Outcomes approached the new government of Sierra Leone, offering to bring the civil war to an end.
The first time we went and saw Strasser that was a bit of an eye-opener. And the atmosphere there, everything sort of rotting from the heat. And it had this enormous desk with these sort of bits of computer and bits of telephone that clearly were not plugged into anything. And the computers were never going to work again, but they were sort of there to create this great impression of power.
Strasser had fought against the RUF as a captain in the army and knew exactly what they would have in store for the population of Sierra Leone.
He was frantic because the RUF were on their way to Freetown. And so Strasser was just desperate to stop the RUF. It was just as simple as that. We said, listen, Mr. President, you may have heard of us. We've been quite successful in Angola, and we would like to help you. And he said, oh, that is wonderful, except we haven't got very much money. so that was that, what, you mean you haven't got any oil?
After numerous visits, they eventually agreed on a price. $1.8 million a month and control of the Koidu kimberlite diamond mine. In March 1995, just 200 Executive Outcomes troops were flown into Sierra Leone, later reduced to 100 to keep costs down. Initially, Executive Outcomes focused on training smaller ethnic groups like the Kamajors and pro-government militias instead of the unreliable government troops. Executive Outcomes soon discovered what they were up against.
Most of the RUF were not actually Sierra Leoneans. They were mainly kids from Liberia. They were the children of all the fighting that had been going on for years in Liberia, and so they were completely lost souls. They were not good soldiers. I mean, the RUF are not good soldiers. They haven't a clue how to actually really fight. Doesn't mean they can't hurt you.
When you fight, when you draw the attack, you don't see who's there in front, you just see bullets. You're gonna come to realize when you overcome, you see the dead bodies. The young boy is now dead with a weapon and everything. That is, it's useless. The young boys being boosted with cocaine, send them to war. They can do nothing. It feels very, very sad. But in order to save yourself, you don't save yourself, that very same kid will kill you. So you do the job.
Despite mainly being made up of children, the RUF forces became notorious for committing acts of terror upon the civilian population. Amputation, abduction, and rape were just some of the atrocities committed by the RUF rebels.
It was terrible. It was the first thing for me in my life to see that. I was a guerrilla war fighter, but we never done that.
I mean, terror in the real sense of terror. You know, if the RUF take your village or town, you have very good reason to be very terrified. That's real terrorism. Oh shit, they're going to slit us open. They're going to chop our hands off. They're going to do this, that. They'll probably bloody well eat us. They'll probably eat bits of us in front of us. You know, God only knows what they're going to do. Terrifying.
Even the hardened veterans of executive outcomes were incensed by what they saw.
There were thousands of innocent victims. And when these mercenaries, these executive outcomes guys saw this, and they saw the kids being killed, hacked to pieces, they went after them. No quarter. They caught them, they killed them.
Those who were lucky, we arrest them. Those who were unlucky, we kill them. That was our mission.
Executive outcomes quickly turned the atrocities of the RUF to their advantage and were seen by the local population as a force for good. To push home their advantage, they devised a new strategy to root out the RUF forces.
We were after their headquarter units, their main units, from the beginning. It was a question of locating the RUF, which we did from the air at night. So with a very, very basic night vision goggles, we would send our helicopter up high enough that they couldn't really hear it, or not exactly hear it, and managed to locate the RUF. And then what we were doing was we were sending in mortar teams with the helicopters, so that at first light, we knew where they were, we knew where the headquarters of those units were, and we then mortared the shit out of them for half an hour, 45 minutes, and then everyone into the helicopter and back. We know that at one time, Ferdy Senko was absolutely convinced that there were 1,000 executive outcomes troops chasing him around, fighting him, when in fact there were 100.
Better suited to attacking civilians than the hardened troops of executive outcomes, the RUF found themselves continually outmaneuvered by a more mobile and advanced force. Eventually, they agreed to a ceasefire. On the 30th of November 1996, the RUF and government signed the Abidjan Peace Agreement to disarmament and demobilization. Once again, a key condition of the ceasefire was that executive outcomes would leave the country.
We weren't really paid until quite a lot later, and then it was very bitty. When we deployed into Sierra Leone, we thought that they did have some money and that we would be paid some money. In the event, they had no money, and we were paying for it ourselves. And I think it was costing about $300,000 a month, and that was coming straight out of Tony and my pocket. And luckily, we'd made, 2 fortunes in Angola, and I reckon we spent one on Sierra Leone. But I'm not worried about having lost a bit of money there. It's fine.
However, with executive outcomes gone, the peace was not to last.
After we left, 6 months in the row of negotiation, the war broke down again.
16,000 UN peacekeepers and ECOMOG troops were brought into the country to try and restore peace. However, they proved ineffective. Routinely disarmed and taken hostage, the peacekeeping force would once again come to rely on mercenaries.
The moral question of whether mercenaries can do good or not, I would argue very strongly that a very small number of people, and in the case of Angola that would be 800, and in the case of Sierra Leone, maximum 200, actually ended 2 wars. They won them. Now, in both those conflicts, there had been UN forces knocking around there, absolutely useless and vastly expensive to the people having to pay for them.
A small band of mercenaries remained in Sierra Leone, and were all that stood in the way of the RUF and the total destruction of the government. Mercenary pilot Neil Ellis stayed behind and played a vital role, gathering intelligence and carrying out gun runs against RUF rebels attempting to assault the capital, Freetown.
With one helicopter gunship, no backup, no ground support, and turned the rebels around back from the gates of Freetown twice. I flew combat with Neil, and it's one of the most striking experiences of my life, because I sat in the gunner's seat in the front of the hive. You've got the pilot sits above the gunner under a bubble. We each had our own bubble, and the way he would go in, low, fast. He knew the country at that stage intimately, and he could spot targets, and he would strafe enemy concentrations and vehicles, whatever he found. And he'd go back to base, rearm, go up again.
This village was attacked. This is where our Soviet troops have been attacked. They've been pushed back. Okay, these rebels are not they're very nearby. Because you see, this is our attack after this morning. Look at all the shit lying around and all the houses burning.
Well, it was getting pretty desperate. It was desperate times at that stage because the United Nations had withdrawn. Most of the expats had withdrawn. In fact, I think there were very few whiteys left in the town, and those who were left because they couldn't get out. So it was a question of either do the job or die.
In January 1999, the RUF and their allies would attack Freetown with a devastating assault known as Operation No Living Thing. Rape, pillage and indiscriminate killing followed, with the government barely clinging to power.
The rebels were advancing quite quickly. There must have been in excess of 1,000. And they were all in vehicles, obviously captured vehicles. And they were down the road quite quickly to Freetown. The Sierra Leonean army was trying to hold them, but the rebels were breaking through. And that night, the Sierra Leonean army broke. And it wasn't a retreat, they ran. The city was on its own at that stage. And I got called out early in the morning to see if I could do another strike. I went out once again, put Yazid in the front cockpit, and then I had some gunners on the side. Fred and a couple of other people that normally came with me. But we weren't exactly sure where they were. So what I decided was that I'll fly down the road, a couple hundred feet above the ground. I knew they would take a pot shot at us. So obviously I had to put myself in a position where once they shot at us, then we could return the fire. We would pick them up, and of course that's what happened. Once we saw the tracer coming past, and once I'd picked up the enemy, the rebels, I positioned myself for a strike and shot a barrage. We destroyed the vehicle with a 14.5 killed quite a few of them, and then came around and just struck some more, did some more strikes. But then I'd run out of ammunition. So returned back to Freetown to rearm, refuel.
When Neil got to Freetown, he found the capital in disarray. He just had time to refuel and rearm and head back to try and halt the rebels in what was becoming an increasingly desperate situation.
I rearmed and I came back that morning. We found the rebels advancing down the road. They had their technicals, trucks, and I managed to destroy some of those. And that was it, I was out of ammunition. So the only way I could do it was to do blind passes on them, just to stop them. Because also, when the Sierra Leone army had seen that the helicopter was back, then they started regrouping at a position a couple of kilometers outside of Freetown. They went out and started consolidating the troops and formed a line to stop the rebels. And that's how the rebels got stopped.
The conflict in Sierra Leone continued until 2002 and eventually led to the deaths of 60,000 men, women and children. Sierra Leone stands as testament to what a small group of well-trained mercenaries can achieve.
The military has achieved a major victory. The mercenaries from Sandline International are going home.
They're being sent home after being hired by the Papua New Guinean Prime Minister, Sir Julius Chan, to succeed where his army had failed and recapture the island of Bougainville.
The island of Bougainville had basically gone absent from being Papua New Guineans. It had been taken over by rebels who had killed numerous police, army and civilians and sort of had declared their independence from the mainland.
The Revolutionary Bougainville Army, or BRA, had taken control of the island.
Now, of course, the interesting thing about Bougainville is it's the world's richest copper mine. And the mountain there, I think, is almost sort of solid copper.
The BRA rebels forced the closure of the mine, saying it was destroying their environment and providing no benefit to the local community. Numerous diplomatic attempts to pacify the BRA failed. Desperate for a quick solution, Prime Minister Julius Chan turned to the mercenary company Sandline International. In December 1996, Tim Spicer, the CEO of Sandline International, was invited to visit Papua New Guinea to appraise the situation. Spicer estimated that for $36 million, his company could put an end to the uprising and reopen the copper mine. Spicer's plan was disregarded on the grounds of being too expensive, and instead, government forces decided to go it alone, with disastrous consequences. In just 6 days, the Papua New Guinean forces were in total disarray and forced into full retreat. Julius Chan decided to pursue the Sandline contract without the consent of his own chief of staff, Jerry Singarok. Sandline was to provide 44 mercenaries to fight alongside the Papua New Guinean Defence Force, 8 from the UK, 5 from Australia and 31 from South Africa. Half of the $36 million was paid up front, with the other half kept back until completion. At the time, Tim Spicer was also in talks with the owners of the copper mine about buying them out.
The mine was owned by a Sydney Stock Exchange quoted company, and we negotiated an option whereby we could buy that company and therefore the mine. So we'd actually set things up in such a way that if we succeeded on our military operation, we would be able to sort of double our money by actually owning the bloody place. Terrible, really. Kind of thing that could give mercenaries a bad name.
The potential profits from both deals were huge. When recruiting the men he needed, Tim Spicer turned to executive outcomes, whose fighters had a proven track record of success.
Sandline did employ executive outcome personnel on their contracts. So, for instance, the contract in Papua New Guinea, the people that came across to run the contract were all from executive outcomes, but this was a contract signed by Sandline.
On the 7th of February 1997, the mercenaries arrived in Papua New Guinea from Singapore.
Tim Spicer did his job too well. And the president became so kind of enamored by Tim and Tim's military knowledge and prowess that he actually said, right, Tim Spicer is now my senior military advisor.
The Australian Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, discovered the plot and leaked the story to the Australian press. It was now that the situation began to unravel. Jerry Singarok, the military chief of staff, read the story and decided to act.
This government has absolutely no confidence in the security forces of its own country.
Guess what? The actual senior military advisor took offense, and he then launched a coup against the president, and of course, in the course of that meant arresting Tim Spicer and ejecting executive outcomes and Sam and the rest of them.
In fact, we never knew what's the problem because we were only mainly going for training. The training was statistically only training the basic training as to become a soldier. It was like, oh, our president have invited mercenaries and they make it big issues.
Public outcry followed with military forces and civilians besieging the Parliament building. Prime Minister Julius Chan was forced to step down, narrowly avoiding a full-blown coup.
We just had a call from our commander that everybody must get into the meeting room. And our leader came and said, listen here, guys, unfortunately, you have to leave the country right now because the political issues is coming against you, they're declaring you as a mercenary. So you better leave before it comes.
The mercenaries were forced to pack their bags and depart. It was becoming increasingly difficult for them to operate below the radar, and their usefulness was coming to an end.
Executive Outcomes was disbanded in 1998 because the ANC by then were in power and they did not want Executive Outcomes to exist at all, anywhere, ever again, and especially not in their backyard. In South Africa, I mean, they've got legislation. They brought in a thing called the FMA, the Foreign Military Assistance Act, which absolutely forbids anything like that. And in fact, South Africa is the only country in the world that has legislation of that sort.
I don't think in a liberal-leaning world today, you're ever going to get total acceptance of hired guns. But the irony is that mercenaries fight for money, but then so does the soldier in the British Army or the American Army or the Australian Army. Everybody fights for money. They've got to live.
Despite proving how effective a small group of well-trained mercenaries can be, the growing list of scandals meant the traditional model of hiring mercenaries was no more. Fighting in Africa's civil wars had been hugely profitable for a few individuals. But within a few years, and in the full glare of the international press, America would invade both Afghanistan and Iraq.
I'd always argued that Executive Outcomes was a flash in the pan. It would never happen again. It wasn't a repeatable business model at all. It was ad hoc, opportunistic, that was it. And I was proved to be completely and utterly wrong because when the Iraq invasion happened and these huge contracts got placed for companies like Blackwater, Aegis, Art Group, etc.
A new generation of security companies would soon transform the image of the mercenary and win the support of the world's richest governments. The potential prizes would grow from a few $1 million into billions.